My husband ignored 41 calls. While I was in labor without twins. Too busy on a yacht with his mistress. Then he saw me on TV. Welcome to her revenge. Thanks for being here. Enjoy my new story. My husband ignored 41 calls while one of our newborn twins was struggling to breathe because he was on a yacht with his mistress. My mother-in-law coldly said, "If you can't raise them, you shouldn't have had them." In court, his sister mocked my clothes, and he threw a check on the table. I see $500 a month. That's too much for a washed-up art restorer. I didn't cry as a restorer. I know some damage can't be fixed, only exposed. And what they don't know is that I've already planted a fatal crack inside their empire, and it will bring them all down. Something about you being here means more to me than you know. Tell me in the comments, what country or city are you watching from? I'm always curious. Who's on the other side of this screen? Please note this story includes fictional elements, added for storytelling and educational purposes. Any resemblance to names or settings is coincidental, but what it has to say to you is deeply intentional. Before I tell you what happened, I need to tell you who I was. The woman who walked into that courtroom 3 years later, the one with the manila envelope, and the expression of someone who has already decided how the day will end. She was not the woman who first measured out turpentine above a coffee shop on Brandon Street. At 29 years old, understanding what happened to me requires understanding what I was made of before it happened, and what I was made of for most of my adult life was patience. My name is Valerie Sterling. I restore paintings, not fix, not clean. Restore, which is an entirely different discipline. When a private collector or a small museum sends me a 17th century Dutch oil that's been stored wrong for decades, my job is not to make it look new. My job is to understand what it originally was, what time and neglect and careless hands have done to it, and to return as much of its integrity as I can. I work with scalpel thinner than credit cards. I work with solvents mixed to the milliliter. I work under ultraviolet light, with my nose 6 inches from a surface that may be worth more than everything I own. My first studio in San Francisco's Soma district was 400 square feet above a coffee shop on Brannan Street. I shared the building's address with a graphic designer who played ambient music through the walls, and a shipping company that kept odd hours. My brushes lived in mason jars. My reference library occupied one entire wall. The whole place smelled like linseed oil and turpentine, and the particular kind of quiet that only comes at 5 in the morning, when the city hasn't decided what it wants to be yet. What I loved about restoration, what I have always loved, is its fundamental honesty. A damaged canvas cannot pretend. The crack network doesn't perform health. The yellowed varnish doesn't smile for the camera. Every surface tells you exactly what has been done to it, exactly where it has been neglected, exactly where someone made the wrong decision. My job was to learn to read all of it without flinching. I remember explaining this to a private collector early in my career, a man who wanted me to simply repaint the damaged areas of a Flemish portrait, rather than address the root causes of the deterioration. Every painting has cracks, I told him. My job isn't to hide them. It's to understand each one well enough to know which ones the structure can hold, and which ones will eventually take down the entire surface. Yeez. He looked at me like I'd said something inconvenient, and went and found someone more agreeable. That told me something about his character that I filed away and never forgot. There are also certain historical pigments, compounds, used by painters and restorers of earlier centuries, who didn't fully understand their chemistry, that behave in ways the restoration community considers irreversible, under sustained exposure to the intense heat of gallery lighting. Not immediately. Sometimes after months, these pigments begin to migrate through the protective varnish layer. They bloom outward from the inside. They make visible what was buried. The field calls it a tragedy. I always thought of it as something else entirely. Evidence that the things we work hardest to conceal tend to find their own way into the light. I had no idea at the time how personally I would come to understand that. It was the spring of 2018. When Ulrich Vaughn walked into my studio. He was not what I expected. The Vaughn name meant something in San Francisco. Old money that had learned enough new vocabulary to stay relevant. What I expected was the client who Googles your credentials the night before and asks questions that are really just statements about their own intelligence. What I got was someone who asked the right questions about the wrong things in exactly the right order. He came in carrying a large oil painting wrapped in moving blankets, a 19th century landscape from the Vaughn family's private collection, badly water damaged along the lower quarter. The varnish had oxidized to near opacity. It was by any objective measure a mess. He set it down against my work table and said nothing for a moment. Just looked at it. Can it be saved? He asked finally. Not can it be fixed, not what's it worth now. Can it be saved? Almost everything can be. I said. Depends on whether what's underneath the damage is still sound. He looked at me directly. And if it is, then we have something to work with. He didn't perform wealth. He didn't name drop the auction house where the family had acquired it, or ask me to cross-reference my estimate with what a Christie's specialist had said. He brought coffee from downstairs the following week. Just coffee. And asked if he could watch me work for an hour. He kept his phone in his pocket. He asked questions when he had them, and stayed quiet when he didn't. In my experience, the ability to be quiet in a room is one of the rarest things in the world. Alaric brought me into his life slowly, not with grand gestures, or the particular condescension I had encountered in other men from that world, the ones who confuse appreciation with ownership. He made me feel like someone worth knowing, which is different from making someone feel beautiful, and more difficult to achieve. I met his mother and sister that fall, at a dinner in their Nob Hill estate. Sybil Vaughn received me with a smile that was technically warm and anatomically cold. Alaric speaks so highly of your work. She said, the emphasis on that last word so precise. It could have been measured with a ruler. Chloe, his younger sister, offered a handshake and an immediate glance across the room toward someone more relevant. Not hostile, calculated every word the correct word, every gesture the appropriate gesture. Nothing more on the drive home. Alaric smoothed it over, the way you do when you've had years of practice at it. I smiled and let it go. I made a note of it, in the part of my mind where I keep things I'm not ready to look at yet. We married in September 2019. Small ceremony, just the people who actually showed up. For us it was Alaric's preference. We don't need their approval, he said. Meaning his family, meaning Sybil's opinion specifically. Standing in a Sonoma vineyard, with the late afternoon light, making everything look like it was painted. I thought that sounded like freedom. I was still learning the difference between freedom and isolation. In June of 2020, I was alone in my studio on a Tuesday morning, when I set a pregnancy test on the edge of my supply shelf, and waited 3 minutes. The room smelled like linseed oil and fixative. The ceiling had a water stain. In the corner I kept meaning to address. Outside, Brandon Street was doing its ordinary morning business. I looked at the 2 pink lines and I thought, this is the most beautiful painting I have ever begun. Alaric, when I told him that evening seemed genuinely happy, or happy enough, convincingly enough. The distinction didn't occur to me then. But here is the thing I have always known, professionally, and in my bones. Beauty is never only what appears on the surface. Every canvas hides its history in the layers beneath. You have to know where to look, and more importantly you have to be willing to look. That summer the first crack began to show. The Varner estate sat at the top of Nob Hill, like a crown that had forgotten it was made to be worn, not worshipped. By the time I was 8 months pregnant, I had walked through those front doors 6 times. The first 5, I counted the minutes until I could leave. The 6th time I started counting something else. Sybil Vaughn had a particular talent, and I recognized it, precisely, because I had spent years working with collectors, who possessed a variation of the same skill, the ability to make every act of interference look like an act of generosity. When I was in my 7th month, she called to recommend her personal obstetrician. The finest maternal fetal specialist in the city. Valerie, I simply couldn't live with myself if I didn't pass along the name. At a gathering in early fall, she rested her hand on my forearm as I reached for the smoked salmon and said quietly enough that only I could hear, "I've been reading about mercury concentrations in certain fish during the 3rd trimester. I'm certain you already know." I just couldn't not say something. Then she gave me the look of a woman who had already decided. I didn't know. She never raised her voice. She never said anything that could be challenged in direct company. The intervention always arrived wrapped in concern, tied with the ribbon of, "I'm only saying this because I care." That is the particular genius of a woman like Sybil. Vaughan, the damage is done before anyone in the room has registered that a weapon was drawn. Chloe was less refined, and in her own way more honest about her intentions. At a family dinner in October, she looked across the table mid-conversation and said it the way you might remark on the weather outside. "I always assumed restorers worked in museums, not basements." There was a beat of light, socially obligated laughter. I looked at Chloe. She was already reaching for her wine glass. Expression pleasantly neutral. The comment discarded behind her like gum wrapper. Alaric said Valerie's studio is in Soma, not a basement, which was geographically accurate and entirely insufficient. I noted the distinction between correcting a fact and addressing a sentiment. I set it in the same mental drawer where I had been setting other things. That fall the drawer was getting heavier by the week. By November, Alaric's LA trips had become a reliable feature of our weekends. The fund required travel. I had always understood that. Investor meetings in New York, partnership reviews in London, the particular geography of money that never stays in one place. What I began to register that fall was a different pattern. Calls that ended the moment I came into the room. His phone face down on every surface all the time, with the quiet consistency of someone who has thought about where their phone is at all moments. A Sunday that developed an urgent need for him in LA. By Saturday evening, one evening I picked up his phone to check the time. Mine was across the apartment on the charger. His screen was unlocked, calendar open. The entry read G. Hurst Quarterly Review. A name, nothing more. When he got home that night, I mentioned it without wait. "Who's G. Hurst?" He didn't pause. "Genevieve Hurst. Her father is a primary investor in the fund. She manages media positioning for several of the family's portfolio holdings, including ours. That review has been on the schedule since July." He loosened his tie, poured a drink. "Something catch your eye?" "Just saw the name," I said. He smiled, moved on. I moved on with him. In December I painted the nursery alone. Elric was in LA. Had been since Wednesday. The due date was 6 weeks out. The room needed 2 coats of sage green, which I had tested on 3 different wall sections before selecting it. A quiet, understated shade that held well under natural morning light. I was on a ladder, cutting in along the crown molding, when my phone buzzed on the floor. It was Chloe. "What color did you end up going with?" I sent her a photo 40 minutes later. She looks a little cheap, but I'm sure it photographs okay. I read the message, set the phone back down, kept painting. Later that evening, I was sorting through the dry cleaning pile to pull out Alaric's charcoal blazer. He'd mentioned needing it for something in Carmel. The following week, the pockets were empty except for a slip of paper, folded once, paper clipped at the top. The way printed confirmations come when you run them off at a hotel business center. I had no specific reason to open it. I opened it. Marina reservation, Monterey Bay, private charter. 2 passengers. The date printed at the top matched. A weekend in September. When Elric had told me he was at a finance conference in San Diego, I stood in the hallway with that paper in both hands, and I did not move for what felt like a long time. Then I refolded it along the original crease, replaced the paper clip at the same angle, put it back in the pocket, and returned the blazer to the pile. I went back to the nursery, finished the ceiling. I am not a NAVE woman. What I am is someone who has spent a professional life learning to distinguish genuine damage from deliberate concealment. And also learning that those two things, when you find them in your own life, require a kind of reckoning you are not always ready to have. The evidence was in my hands. I chose to put it back. I told myself I was reading into nothing. I told myself the explanations were reasonable. I painted the ceiling of that room, alone in the December quiet of a city I had built my life in, and I told myself I was being paranoid. Then January came, and in one night, I learned what it truly costs to need someone, with every cell in your body, and to reach for the phone, and find only silence on the other end. It was 2:43 in the morning when Iris stopped breathing right. I know the exact time, because I have never permitted myself to forget it. Some numbers you hold because they mean something good. I keep this one, because it keeps me honest, about what that night actually was, about who showed up and who didn't, about the irreversible clarity that comes when the last reason to look away finally goes. Iris was making a sound I had no word for. Not crying. Something smaller than crying and more alarming for it. A shallow rattling draw of air, each one slightly harder than the last. Her small chest, working in a way no pamphlet had prepared me for. I picked her up. She was warm in the way that isn't comfort. The kind of warm that has a number attached to it. I called Alaric. 6 rings voicemail. His recorded voice smooth and unhurried, asking me to leave a message. I called him 41 times that night. I counted, because counting was the one thing fully in my control. Not Iris's breathing, not the clock, not Theo stirring in his crib. I counted the way I count brush strokes, with attention, because attention is what keeps the whole surface from coming apart. While counting, I was doing everything else. I wrapped Iris in the fleece Diana had sent. When the twins arrived, I settled Theo with one hand, and pulled up the cab app with the other. I packed the diaper bag in under 2 minutes. All of this in the dark. 3 weeks after a C-section. In an apartment, where only one other adult was supposed to be reachable, and wasn't. After the 22-second unanswered call, I called Sybil. There was no one else. My mother had been gone since I was 23. My father was 400 miles away. In the geography of people I could call at 3:00 in the morning, Sybil Vaughan was the only name left. She answered on the 4th ring. No confusion, she surfaced from sleep already precise. It's Valerie. Iris is having trouble breathing. I can't reach Alaric. I'm taking her to SF. General Keith, if you cannot manage 2 infants on your own. She said, each syllable weighted deliberately. Perhaps that is something you should have thought about before having them. The line went quiet. I stood in the hallway of our apartment, with my daughter against my chest, and noted those words methodically, in the part of my mind reserved for evidence. Then I called Diana. Diana Reyes had been my closest friend since graduate school, a photographer by profession, a problem solver by instinct, and the person who, when I called at 3:00 in the morning, picked up on the 2nd ring. Iris. I said just the one word. Send me the address. She said, go now. She was at the emergency entrance. 12 minutes after I walked through the door. She took one look at me, holding both children, and lifted Theo from my arm without being asked. I've got him, you go. The attending physician in the pediatric unit moved with the quiet speed of someone excellent at a job that demands not appearing rushed. Early stage bacterial pneumonia, serious, treatable. Caught in time. With a 3-week-old. Hours matter, she said carefully. Another few hours of that labored breathing, and the conversation would have been a different one. She said it gently. I received it precisely. Iris was admitted. I sat beside the small bed, with my hand wrapped around fingers, the size of pencil erasers, and did not cry. Crying belongs to a grief that still believes relief is coming. What I felt was something older, the kind that goes in and sets like primer under a damaged surface. At 6:15 my phone lit up. Alaric Vaughan calling. I watched it ring 9 times. Then I turned it face down on the cushion, and placed my hand back on Iris's. Diana came in at 7:00 with 2 coffees from the vending machine. She sat across from me and didn't ask about the phone. At some point she set her cup down, Random thing that studio clip you posted in October. Keeps showing up in my feed. Some blank account, no name, no profile photo. Keeps sharing it into big art communities repeatedly. Don't know if you set something up on the back end, but it's strange. I nodded. Filed it somewhere below the surface. I had nothing left to think about what it meant. Iris fever broke at 9:47. I held her against my chest and thought quietly and completely. The thought that had been forming since I set that phone face down. I will not spend one more hour of my life waiting for someone who has already decided where he is. Some things cannot be restored. Not because the damage is too great, but because the person responsible for the damage never stopped causing it. I just needed one thing first. I needed to see the truth with my own eyes before I could decide what came next. 3 days after the hospital, I waited until both children were asleep, sat down across from Alaric at the kitchen table, and asked him one question. Not about Genevieve. I hadn't confirmed that name as anything more than a calendar entry. Not about Monterey. Just this: do you still want this life? He performed briefly. The lean forward. The measured pause of a man reaching for authentic looking remorse. The production lasted approximately 40 seconds before something in his face made a small, quiet shift. The kind of deterioration that's only visible if you've spent a career learning to see what moves beneath surfaces. The performance retired. What was underneath it was much simpler and much worse. Honestly, Valerie, he said, this has been difficult. Not the marriage, not the children, not me. This as if our entire life together had been a project that ran over schedule and over budget. And he was finally allowing himself to say so. I placed the Marina receipt on the table between us. The one I had refolded along its original crease and returned to his blazer pocket 6 weeks before. He looked at it. The way men look at things they've already accepted. They cannot argue their way out of. He could have tried. Instead he sat back. Her name is Genevieve Hurst. He set it with a particular weight. The weight of someone who believes a name alone should communicate. The scale of the decision should make the other person understand that this was not a failure of character, but a movement toward a larger orbit. As if the name Hurst was meant to do the explaining. For him, she belongs to a different world, Valerie. Her family, what they have, this isn't personal. You conducted an affair for months, I said. And you'd like me to understand it isn't personal. He didn't answer that. He was already past the stage of the conversation where my questions required responses. He was gone by that afternoon. His possessions arrived by moving company 2 days later. Within 72 hours, his legal team had frozen our joint accounts, filed the divorce petition, and submitted a motion challenging the equitable division of assets that my attorney read twice before sitting down and looking at me very carefully. They moved with the seamless efficiency of a contingency that had been prepared before I ever asked the question at that kitchen table, which told me exactly how long the question had been on the way. My attorney, a family law specialist on Montgomery Street, whose particular kind of calm I would come to lean on heavily in the coming weeks, sat across from me in her office and explained the financial reality in terms that were both thorough and brutal. Before the divorce filing, Alarica's team had restructured his compensation through 2 holding companies, one registered in Delaware, one in the Cayman Islands. In the United States, child support calculations are based primarily on a parent's W-2 income, the official employment income reported annually to the IRS, with his salary converted to consulting fees routed through those corporate structures. Alaric's personal W-2 showed nearly 0 earned income. The fund could be worth considerably more, and the paper would still read the same. The court orders based on disclosed figures, she explained. $500 monthly is the temporary support order, while we pursue discovery motions to locate and value his actual assets. Discovery in a case like this can take many months. His legal team has the resources and the experience to delay that process, and delay causes real damage. In the meantime, I want you to understand the system as it actually operates, not as you might assume it does. I understood the system. I also understood, without saying so yet, that a financial architecture built on deliberate concealment had structural vulnerabilities. Something hidden requires constant maintenance. I filed the thought and said nothing about it. The family court conference room was beige and fluorescent lit, and smelled like the recycled air of a building full of difficult conversations. I had passed the courthouse on Bryant Street 100 times, without once imagining I would sit where I was now. Sit at a laminate table, across from Alaric Vaughan and his senior attorney, negotiating the formal end of a marriage, over documents I hadn't seen until that morning. Alaric had dressed for it, not for the proceeding, for the performance. The suit was his best one. His confidence was arranged on his face, like a feature of the room. He looked at me for a long moment, then he slid the check across the table. Valerie. My name like a preface to a corrective. Look at yourself. 36 years old. Hands that carry the smell of paint stripper. No matter how many times you wash them. Running on no sleep. With 2 infants. And a phone full of restoration videos that a handful of people watch. You genuinely believe that puts you in the same category as the people sitting in this room. He let it rest. Genevieve Hurst could purchase the museum, where you've been submitting freelance applications, with a single call. Her family could buy the block the museum sits on. He glanced at the check, the way you glance at a minor administrative task you've completed. And those children, a $500 a month. That's generous, given what I actually believe they're capable of contributing. The room held very still. I did not look at the check. I looked at Alaric Vaughan, at the specific texture of ease on his face, the complete absence of anything resembling conscience, and I committed every syllable to the category of memory. That does not erode with time. I have replayed that speech in exact sequence many times since that morning, and I have never once needed to reconstruct a word of it. It arrived complete. It stayed complete. Behind him in the second row of observer seats, Sybil sat with her hands arranged in her lap. She said nothing. Her expression communicated everything necessary about who had spent the previous week helping her son locate the right language. I have never cashed that check. In the hallway outside, Chloe fell into step beside me near the elevators. That coat, she performed a brief appraisal, head tilting. That's from last season, isn't it? You look genuinely exhausted, honestly. Don't let the door hit you on the way out. I stopped. I looked at Chloe Vaughan for a long, specific moment. Long enough that maintaining the pleasantry and her expression required visible effort. Then I walked to the elevator and stepped inside. I didn't have the words yet. What I had was the beginning of a collection, and the patience to wait until I had enough of them. Moving out took one afternoon. I took my equipment, my reference library, and 2 boxes of Von family material I had been holding in professional trust. Pieces commissioned for assessment and restoration before the marriage ended. Among them was a gilded frame containing an oil landscape I had photographed, documented, and begun cleaning but had not fully examined. The frame itself I hadn't looked at closely. I had meant to. I set it in the back of my car, alongside everything else. I moved into a 2-bedroom apartment on Valencia Street, in the Mission District, with $6,800 in my personal account, 2 3-month-old infants, and 1 painting I still hadn't finished looking at. I didn't know that afternoon what was waiting inside that frame. I didn't know I would have a reason to go back to it. Until the night I came closest to walking away from everything I had left to build. The apartment on Valencia Street was 420 square feet. I know this because I measured it twice before signing the lease. Once from the dimensions on the listing, once with a physical tape measure, borrowed from the landlord downstairs. I am the kind of person who measures before she commits. With the portable cribs arranged end to end in the bedroom, there was a strip of floor between them and the wall, just wide enough to require turning sideways to reach the window. The restoration equipment occupied the back half of the kitchen table. Reference materials lived in milk crates under the counter. The only consistent light source in my workspace was the adjustable lamp I'd had since graduate school, which now served a surface I used alternately for pigment, mixing and cutting bananas. It was mine. Nothing in it owed anything to anyone named Vaughn. That first 6 weeks established several things I had not previously known about myself. I learned I could sustain focus on a thread thinner than a human hair. After 4 hours of broken sleep, I learned the particular sound of Iris breathing in the next room was something my nervous system would monitor from any distance indefinitely. And I learned that 3 professional rejections, arriving in the same week, wrapped in the same careful language, could function as a form of weather. A low-pressure system that doesn't announce itself directly, but changes the atmosphere of everything inside it. The call from the Presidio Heights Gallery that Tuesday was the most precise. We've decided to move forward with someone whose availability is a bit more flexible for this project's timeline. I thanked her genuinely and set the phone down next to 2 formula bottles that needed washing. I stood in the kitchen for a moment. Flexible schedule was the professionally acceptable phrase for not working around 2 infants. I understood the translation. I did not have a solution for it yet. That night, the 3rd consecutive night of running the same accounting in my head, while Iris needed her 3 a.m. feeding, I sat in the low lamplight and added numbers that refused to add up differently, no matter how I arranged them. Rent formula, electric phone bill, the child support payment 11 days late, with no message explaining it. I laid the figures out in order, moved them around, laid them out again. Theo on the floor mat beside me reached up and wrapped 4 fingers around my index finger. He was 8 weeks old. His grip had the serious, uninformed confidence of someone who has not yet learned to assess the odds before committing. In that moment, it was exactly what the situation required. "All right," I said to both of them and to no one. "All right." Iris watched me from the crook of my arm, with the deliberate attention she had already made her defining characteristic. Even at 8 weeks, she processed before she reacted, observed the full situation before arriving at a conclusion. She looked at me that night the way you look at a load-bearing wall. You are in the middle of deciding whether to trust. I decided to be trustworthy. Diana arrived 2 weeks later without calling ahead. She had the tamales from the place on 2040 Street and a thermos of coffee, strong enough to qualify as a statement. She walked into the apartment, looked at it once, said nothing about the milk crates or the lab equipment, sharing space with the dish rack, and set the tamales down on the clear section of counter. "How much sleep?" "Enough." "That means not enough." She moved a tube of Damar varnish and sat at the table. "Tell me the work situation." I did the 3 emails, the phone call, the $500 sitting in Alaric's account for 11 days, while my landlord's automatic withdrawal queued. For the 15th, Diana listened the way she always listens. Complete attention. No performance of sympathy. No interjection before you've finished. Then film yourself working. I post sometimes, the channel exists. You post announcements. That's not the same thing. She leaned forward on her elbows. That Caravaggio reproduction your neighbor brought in. The one you're using to demonstrate cleaning technique. Set up your phone and film the surface crack treatment. Real time, your actual voice. No script, no production. Art. People online are obsessed with watching restoration. In process, there's something about seeing small, damaged things being carefully fixed. People can't look away from it. Surface crack networks. The fine web of fractures that develops in aged oil paintings, as the paint layer contracts over decades, require patient, methodical work. Under magnification. The process is painstaking and apparently watchable. Who is going to watch me work? In a kitchen that also doubles as a studio and a nursery, Diana gave me the look she reserves for statements she considers unworthy of the person making them. "You restored a $4 million Monet last year. The condition assessment alone took 6 weeks. You understand paint chemistry at a level most conservators with museum appointments don't reach. Flat factual, you are sitting in 400 square feet. Acting like your expertise expired when your marriage did. Film yourself. Start small, that's the entire instruction. I set up the shot at 11:15 that night. Foam propped in the neck of a linseed fixative jar. A solution used to stabilize paint layers positioned so the lens caught the work surface cleanly. Adjustable lamp at the angle that reduced glare. The reproduction flat on the table. Its crack network visible under direct light as a fine web of surface fissures across the Baroque style composition. I pressed record and I worked. I described what I was doing in the voice I use when I am explaining something to myself. Not a performance, not a presentation, just narration. The patience required to address 1 millimeter at a time. The difference between damage that the structure can carry and damage that will eventually compromise everything beneath it. I posted at 11:47 and fell asleep before the screen registered a single view. In the morning, I picked up the phone from the nightstand. 14,000 views. I sat down on the kitchen floor in the grey early light, both children still asleep, and I looked at that number for a long quiet moment. Among the accounts that had shared the video pushed it, specifically, into the largest art restoration communities. The platform hosted was one account with no display name, no profile photograph, no post history, a grey default avatar and nothing else. No trace of identity, and it had sent the video directly to exactly the communities most likely to respond to it. I could not explain it. I looked at 14,000 views and thought someone, somewhere wanted this to be seen. I didn't know who. I didn't know why. I knew only that I had 14,000 reasons to continue. On a morning when I had badly needed reasons, I got up off the floor and started the coffee. By July the channel had passed 200,000 subscribers. I was still calculating rent at the start of every month. That part hadn't changed, but something in the nature of the calculation had. I was no longer asking whether the numbers would cover what was necessary. I was asking what I could do with what was left over. That is a different kind of arithmetic, and it takes a different kind of mind to run it. The routine had found its own shape. Diana came 3 to 4 days each week, staying overnight on nights when I had professional deadlines requiring uninterrupted hours. My working windows were 5 to 8 in the morning, before the twins fully surfaced, and 9 at night through midnight. After they were down, Diana slept lightly in the front room and considered it genuinely a reasonable arrangement. "I don't sleep much anyway," she said once, "and you work better in the dark." Both of these things were true. A small gallery in the Castro had brought me on for freelance restoration work. Modest commissions, modest fees, but documented, professional engagements that were slowly rebuilding. The kind of record that gets a restorer through a door. I took everything they sent me. That week's piece came from a private collector, via the gallery, a mid-century oil landscape that had spent years stored near a heating unit. Long enough for the damage to move through multiple protective layers. I worked on it on camera, explaining the condition as I went, the way I do when I'm thinking through a problem out loud, rather than performing a lesson. What we're dealing with here is the result of heat-sensitive pigments, compounds that were used routinely through the early and mid-20th century by painters and restorers who didn't fully understand their chemical instability. With sustained exposure to high-intensity gallery lighting, or in this case, a heating unit, these molecules don't fail immediately. That's what makes them deceptive. After months under those conditions, they begin to migrate through the protective varnish layer slowly, without announcing themselves, and then they bloom outward. You see it on the surface first as subtle discoloration, then structural distortion, then irreversible failure. The professional community considers this category of damage a particular tragedy, because once the migration begins, it cannot be reversed. The varnish layer, that was supposed to contain the compounds, has already been compromised. From within I moved on to the next step. No particular significance attached to any of it, just the work and the explanation that goes with it. The letter from Sybil's legal team arrived. Through my attorney at the end of July. 30 days to collect remaining items. Or have them considered abandoned. The language was clean and entirely in character. For the person who sent it, Diana stayed home with Theo and Iris. I drove to Nob Hill alone. The estate looked exactly the same from the street. That's the thing about buildings built for permanence. They perform it. Long after the circumstances that produced them have shifted. I sat in the parked car for a moment before going in. Not hesitation. The specific deliberateness of someone who has thought carefully about how to enter a room that once had leverage over her. Sybil was in the front reception room when I arrived, positioned in the chair nearest the window, with something to read. She did not look up. The housekeeper, a composed, efficient woman I had known by name for 3 years, came to direct me toward the restoration room, in the east wing. As I moved through the main hallway, Sybil's voice came from behind me, not directed at me, directed very precisely at the housekeeper, standing near the doorway. I trust she said I still on the page, that she knows which items are hers. Third person I was 8 feet away and fully audible. I continued down the hall. The restoration room was exactly as I had left it, 10 months before. The same organized surfaces, the same smell of preserved materials, and climate-controlled air. The work I'd left unfinished was still there. The final pieces of a private collection I'd been assessing and treating before November 2020, when professional focus had become a luxury I couldn't maintain. I packed systematically. No ceremony about it. This room had been the only space in the entire estate where I had operated on my own terms, and leaving it didn't require anything from me except efficiency. Near the end of the inventory I lifted a gilded frame. I had logged but not yet fully processed. A landscape, in the manner of early American regionalism. Small in scale, condition noted as stable. I had photographed the front, documented the surface, recorded it in the assessment file. The frame structure itself I had not examined. I turned it over. The backing board, the flat protective panel, sealed to the rear of the frame, to shield the canvas from dust, moisture and handling damage, had been resealed. In practice, this means the original backing is applied once, with consistent adhesive, and both the material and the bonding agent, aged together uniformly. Over decades what I was looking at was different. Along the lower edge of the backing, a section had been separated, and re-adhered at a later date. The overlap was slight, a few millimeters where the edges didn't align flush, and the adhesive, under close examination, showed a subtly different surface quality than the original, the kind of inconsistency that is invisible under casual handling, and becomes visible only at the specific angle I happen to be holding the frame. In my profession, inconsistency is the only thing worth interrupting. Good work, for. I laid the frame face down in the transport carton, packed moving paper around it with careful hands, and labeled the box with the same notation I used for any item requiring further examination. I did not open it. Not in this house. Not on Sybil Vaughan's property, with her somewhere on the floor above, and 30 years of family authority built into the architecture around me. I carried the box to my car, loaded the remaining materials and closed the trunk. When I looked up, Sybil was at the second floor window, looking down at the street, looking more specifically at me. We held that for a moment. Across the distance between us, she didn't move. Neither did I. Then I got into the driver's seat and pulled away from Nob Hill. For the last time. That night, both children asleep before 9. I set the gilded frame on my work surface. Under the desk lamp I cut the resealed section of backing with a conservation scalpel. Steady, controlled, along the line of the original adhesive edge. Below it, folded once along a vertical crease, was a sheet of paper with the specific yellow of something that has been aging in the dark for decades. The letterhead read Von Family Trust. The year beneath it was 1987. I read the first 2 paragraphs slowly, set the document down, read them again. I didn't finish it that night. I didn't need to. 2 paragraphs was enough. What they contained, the specific, careful legally constructed language, of someone who had written something important, and hidden it with equal care, told me that this paper was real and that it mattered, and that whatever it meant, it was going to matter significantly. I photographed every page. 12 photograph standardized lamp angle, archival ruler in frame, the documentation protocol I use for materials with disputed provenance. I returned the original to a sealed archival envelope, and locked it in the fireproof box, where I keep assets under legal review. I knew enough about paper oxidation, about ink aging, about document preservation, to know this wasn't a forgery. What I didn't yet know was what it meant for the family that had spoken about me, in the third person, while I was standing in the same room. I put it away, told myself I would understand when it was time. That time was still ahead of me. Autumn in San Francisco arrives on its own terms. The fog burns off a little later every morning. The light goes low and golden around 4:00 in the afternoon. I marked the season that year not by temperature, but by subscriber counts and shoe sizes. Theo outgrowing his infant Nikes somewhere in October. Iris refusing to wear shoes at all. And the channel crossing a threshold I had written down 3 months earlier, as a number that still felt theoretical. When I wrote it, 1 million subscribers came on a Tuesday. Diana drove over that afternoon, with a white cake from the bakery on Guerrero Street. White frosting, blue lettering, 1M. She set it on the kitchen table next to my open laptop, cut 2 slices without asking and handed one to me. Say something, she said. I'm trying to calculate what this changes. About the electric bill. I said, that's your opening. That's what I'm thinking about. She looked at me for a moment. Fair, she said, and ate her cake. What I was actually calculating was more consequential than the electric bill. And I spent the rest of that afternoon working through it, while Diana took the twins to Dolores Park. A subscriber base at that scale made me a viable proposition to a specific category of brand partnerships that had been out of reach before. Premium art supply manufacturers, professional archival materials companies, the kind of brands whose customers understand technique and will pay for access to an audience that does too. Not celebrity partnerships, industry ones. That distinction mattered to my professional credibility, and I wasn't going to compromise it for a number. The conversation with the first serious sponsor came in November. A premium art supply house based in Chicago. Family owned, 60 years in the trade. The kind of company that had been making pigments the right way since before most of their competitors existed. 3-month sponsored series, integrated into the restoration content, rather than separated from it. The fee was larger than any single year of income one had earned before the channel existed. I did the arithmetic carefully, the way I approach everything. It covered the studio rental I had been pricing for months. It covered childcare contingency through the spring. It covered the gap between what I could earn from commissioned restoration work alone and what I needed to operate without counting every week's income twice. And in the middle of running those numbers, the specific irony of the figure landed on me with a precision I hadn't expected. I was looking at a contract for more money than the man who had placed $500 on a courtroom table had calculated I would ever justify. He hadn't said it that directly. He had said it by implication, by that particular Vaughn family talent for communicating dismissal through the most efficient possible means. The studio came together in December. A 400 square foot room on 18 Titch Street. Utility sink, north-facing window for consistent light. And the very specific quiet that only exists when there are no children in a building. 10 minutes from home. Diana handled the twins during studio hours. I handled everything in the studio. The clarity of that structure was something I hadn't fully understood. I needed until I had it. Theo and Iris at 9 months were already operating on entirely different software. Theo treated every physical boundary as a debate, rather than a fact, pulling himself up along the couch edge, falling standing again, with the undiscouraged efficiency of someone who has classified failure as a data point rather than an outcome. Iris watched him attempt this for 2 full weeks. Then one afternoon, she pulled herself to standing on her first try, held it for 30 seconds, with the focus of someone who decided to do a thing, only after she had already worked out how, and lowered herself back down, in a movement that looked more like a choice than a fall. I watched both of them and thought, I know exactly who you're going to be. That winter, I replaced bedtime stories with restoration narration. It had started accidentally. They were restless one evening. I was too tired to construct a narrative, with a beginning, and an arc. And I described what I'd been working on in the studio. The color decisions, the solvent concentrations, the patience that consolidation work demands. They both settled. I kept going. Iris slept faster when I described solvent chemistry. Theo preferred the pigment mixing segments. I chose to find this precise and funny in equal measure. And I let myself believe. It said something accurate about who they each were. The court hearing was scheduled for March. 14 months had passed since the initial filing. California law requires a minimum 6-month waiting period from the date of legal service before a divorce can be finalized, and Alaric's attorneys had extended the timeline considerably beyond that, through successive motions, challenging the scope of the asset discovery process. By the time we convened in that conference room, I had existed in a legal state of partial marriage for over a year. His attorney led with the channel. 1 million subscribers, he argued, represented a demonstrated capacity for substantial income generation that justified revisiting the current support arrangement. He used the phrase content entrepreneur with the fluency of someone who had spent 45 minutes becoming conversant in a field he was in the process of mischaracterizing. My attorney, who had spent considerably longer, responded with the accuracy the argument deserved. Subscriber count is an audience metric. It does not equal revenue. 12 months of documented channel income had been disclosed in full. Sponsorship contracts had been disclosed in full. Earnings from restoration commissions had been disclosed in full. The channel was a professional asset, not a concealed income stream, and the distinction was foundational to any honest application of the relevant statutes. The judge accepted the framing. The $500 monthly child support order held a separate enforcement action. Notation was added to the record, referencing the still pending discovery motions concerning Alaric's restructured compensation structure, the shell company architecture that had been delaying an accurate picture of his actual financial position. For over a year, the asset division followed the logic of the financial structure he had built, which meant the outcome landed the way outcomes tend to land when one party has had sophisticated legal preparation. Since before the conversation that started the proceedings, Alaric was present at the hearing. He addressed deliberately for it. The confidence I had known during the marriage was the same in volume, but it sat on him differently now, assembled, arranged, like something he had made a decision to wear that morning, rather than something that simply existed in him. In the corridor afterward, he walked past without speaking. Then at the turn toward the elevator he glanced back. A brief specific look, the expression of a man running a calculation, whose result has come out different than projected. I noted it. Some expressions are worth keeping. Standing on the courthouse steps in the March wind, the cold, working through my coat in the particular way SF. Cold does not sharp, just present and sustained. I called Diana Adon. She asked, the paperwork's done, I said. A pause. That's not the same thing. No, I said. Some things end on paper and keep going everywhere else. And some things that were supposed to be over. I stopped watching the traffic on Bryant Street move. The way it always does. Indifferent and continuous are only just starting. That evening, going through my messages, I found a text from a number that took me a moment to identify. The area code was right. The contact, when I checked, confirmed it. Chloe, hey. I just wanted to check in. How are you doing? The babies. I read it once, read it again. This was the woman who had told me not to let the door hit me. The woman who had texted that. The nursery color looked cheap. while I painted the ceiling alone. 7 months pregnant. Reaching out now with a message that was simultaneously awkward and underneath its awkwardness, apparently genuine, which was the last combination I would have predicted from any member of that family. I didn't reply, but I didn't delete it either. Some things you keep, precisely because you don't yet understand what they're telling you. The afternoon Chloe Vaughan appeared at my door. I was 3/4 through filming a segment on Byzantine gilding, the application of 23-karat gold leaf to an icon panel restoration, a process that demands dry hands, completely still air, and the kind of focused attention that makes an unexpected knock feel like something thrown at you. Gold leaf at that thickness is less than 1/10 of a micron. It moves with the breath of someone opening a door 2 rooms away. Every interruption has consequences. She had my address. I noted that before I noted anything else. The divorce filings listed the general area, but a specific apartment on a specific street requires something more deliberate than a public record search. Either she had asked around with more effort than I would have credited her, or someone had provided it without considering the implications. I filed both possibilities and answered the door. I hit stop on the camera, and then, a habit that predates the situation by about 15 years. The instinct of someone who has spent a career documenting things before she understands their significance. I opened the voice memo application on my phone and pressed record, sliding the screen face down on the table. In one practiced motion, I want to be clear about what that recording was. Personal documentation. The way a field notebook is personal documentation. The real evidence I would walk out of that afternoon with was the photographs. But I have always been a person who captures everything before she decides what matters. Chloe in the doorway had put considerable effort into appearing composed. The effort was visible. Her jacket was right, her hair was right. Her expression had been arranged into something that approximated ease. Her hands weren't quite convinced. I let her in, not from any warmth toward her. She had spent 3 years making her opinion of me clear in the particular language the Vans preferred, which was technically correct and anatomically cold. I let her in because something unexpected had arrived, and I needed to understand it fully before I could determine what to do with it. She made a comment about the apartment. "You've really made it work," she said, which is what people say when the space is smaller than they expected, and they want credit for not saying so. The twins were at Dolores Park with Diana. Chloe's eyes moved around the room with the specific restlessness of someone looking for information she's pretending not to look for. We moved through the pleasantries at the speed they deserved. Then she told me what she needed. "I have some items I need to move quietly. Estate pieces, jewelry, things with real value. I need someone with the right world contacts who can find private buyers without going through auction houses or registered dealers." I set my gilding brush on the palette rest. "What kind of items?" "Family pieces, things I have access to." "Access to," I said. "Not ownership of." Something shifted behind her expression. "Do you have those connections or not? Does your mother know about this?" The silence that followed was its own complete answer. The actual situation, which came out over the next 20 minutes, in the specific way that things come out when someone has been carrying them alone too long, and finally has to set them down somewhere, was this: Chloe had been gambling at a private club on Sacramento Street in Pacific Heights for the better part of a year. The kind of establishment that doesn't maintain a public profile because its clientele prefers not to be tracked. The accumulated debt had reached approximately $220,000. The people holding that debt operated with the patience of a billing cycle and the temperament of something considerably less forgiving. For 8 months, she had been selling Sybil's jewelry through 2 separate operations, a pawnbroker in North Beach and a second buyer in the Sunset District, having calculated correctly that her mother's collection was large enough and her attention specific enough that individual absences would take time to register. The calculation had held so far. 2 weeks before she came to my door, She had opened her email and found a photograph. Herself from street level outside her building. Timestamp from 3 days before she received it. No message, no sender name she recognized. No explanation. That would have made the explanation less clear. She came to me because Sybil could not know. The jewelry was. Sybil's alaric was unavailable. In the way people are unavailable. When their own crisis has consumed all available capacity. The police were structurally impossible. Because reaching out to the police required first explaining the theft. And Valerie, the woman she had told not to let the door hit her. The woman whose taste she had dismissed in a text, while I was painting alone on a ladder, was the only person within reach, who navigated the private art and estate market outside conventional channels, and who Chloe had decided, from a long habit of underestimating me, she could manage. She had brought the receipts with her. She wanted me to assess the remaining items' value. I looked through them. 12 transactions slips spanning from the previous August. Itemized descriptions. Dollar amounts, dates, shop references. I looked at them long enough to understand exactly what I was looking at. And exactly what they documented. Give me a minute, I said. I need some water. Can I bring you anything? In the kitchen. With the door at the angle that preserves privacy. Without blocking sound. I photographed every receipt. Not casually, systematically. Every item description. Every date. Every transaction amount and location reference. The same documentation method I use for provenance. Materials of disputed origin. For minutes complete. I returned with 2 glasses of water. And set one in front of her. I can't help you move any of these pieces, I said. I won't be any part of selling property that isn't yours. But I'm not going to contact your mother. Or your brother about what you've told me today either. A pause timed deliberately. As long as we understand each other. She looked at me. With the expression of a person who has arrived at a destination. She was certain she had mapped correctly. And found the layout had changed. She had walked in believing the advantage was with her. That I was manageable. That she knew the dimensions of what she was dealing with. She walked out without what she came for. In the last second, before she turned toward the elevator, I saw it, the specific, private look of someone recalculating. From the beginning, I called Diana from the kitchen counter. I'm in a significantly better position than I was 2 hours ago. Should I ask? Not yet. How significantly? She said, enough that I'm going to need you to stay late Thursday. I said, I have some things to think through. After I hung up, I sat at the work table and looked at the lockbox. On the shelf above, my reference materials, the 1987 document, 7 months in that envelope sealed, waiting for me to understand what I was holding, well enough to do something with it. Chloe's visit had clarified something I had been slow to see. The pieces around me were already in motion. I needed to understand my own inventory before the board shifted further. I called the document authentication department at UCSS the following morning. They had an opening in 3 weeks. I took it without hesitation. I had the photographs. I had the audio of the conversation as my own record of what had been said, not evidence I planned to present in any proceeding, but a precise account for myself in my own archive of exactly what Chloe Vaughan had told me on a Tuesday afternoon in April. When she thought she was the one with the leverage, I had a document in a sealed envelope that had been growing heavier every week. I left it unopened. What I hadn't yet understood was that the secrets I was holding weren't the only ones in play. Someone else had been watching this situation from the beginning, and what they had been building, I was only about to begin to see. Before I reveal what I found inside that painting, type 9 in the comments right now. Just that number. It tells me you're still here. And that means something to me. A note before we continue. This story contains some fictional elements, shaped for the purpose of telling it well. If that's not for you, this is a perfectly good moment to step away. And I mean that kindly. In May I accepted what appeared, on its surface, to be the most professionally significant contract I'd been offered in years. A gallery in Hayes Valley wanted a full condition assessment and restoration on a large, Impressionist canvas. Before an international loan exhibition. The following spring. The terms were reasonable. The timeline was workable. The piece itself, from the initial photographs, was exactly the kind of work I had built my career to handle. I didn't look at the sponsoring patron's name on the intake file until I was 2/3 through the paperwork. Genevieve Hurst. I set the folder down on my work table and left it there for a moment. The Hurst Foundation had supported several Hayes Valley cultural programs in recent years. Attaching their name to institutional sponsorship was standard practice. Genevieve hadn't reached out to me. She almost certainly didn't know who was handling the assessment. I was a specialist name on a document she hadn't signed. I picked the folder back up and kept reading. I took the contract. The painting arrived for intake in the second week of May. A large-scale work, presented with a complete-looking provenance trail through 3 private European owners before its current custodianship. I unpacked it under full-spectrum lighting and began the systematic documentation. I ran on every new intake, infrared imaging, ultraviolet, cross-section analysis of the paint layers, under magnification. Within 4 hours I had concerns that were not small. A painting carries its history in its layers, and reading those layers, honestly, is the central skill of my profession. The restoration intervention, visible in the lower right quarter, identifiable through the refractive difference, under ultraviolet, was inconsistent with the period described in the documentation. A work of the stated age, restored in the stated decade, would show specific material characteristics. These showed different ones. Not dramatically different, carefully different. The kind of difference that takes training to see, an effort to obscure. The ownership documentation had a gap, clean and conventional in its presentation. 1985 through 1993, 8 years. No recorded exhibition. No insurance record. No auction provenance. The kind of silence that isn't accidental. I ran the work through the art loss register. The ALR is the international database that professional conservators are professionally obligated to consult. As standard due diligence, it cross-references lost and stolen works against Interpol notifications and the FBI art crime team's records. The search returned a result in under 20 minutes. A Munich-based collector had filed an Interpol theft notification in 1993 for a work matching this description. The piece had never been recovered. The filing remained open. I sat with that for a long time. Then I thought about Alaric. During the discovery period of the divorce, I had encountered enough of the Von Capital financial architecture to understand the fund's structural position, without being given anything close to the complete picture. What was available through public filings told me enough. The fund had experienced significant investor withdrawals over 18 months, beginning in 2021, and its bridge financing position had become increasingly precarious. I had read in a completely unrelated fraud case 2 years prior about a European investor category that required art collateral to be provenance performed, publicly exhibited at a recognized international venue, before accepting it as security against a loan. The exhibition function as independent market validation. Without the show, no loan. Without the loan, the fund's liquidity crisis became irreversible. Alaric needed this painting exhibited. He believed the documentation surrounding it was sound. He had no particular reason to question it, because the provenance certification system he had been using for years, I was about to learn, had my professional name attached to it, in ways I had never authorized. I reached out to a former colleague from my museum consulting years, a conservator who had worked alongside the FBI's art crime team on a trafficking investigation. In 2018 I explained what I'd found. He made a call. 3 days later, I had an appointment at the DOJ's Cultural Property Protection Unit in the federal building on Golden Gate Avenue. Special Agent Renata Okafor ran the meeting with the precision of someone who had already reviewed the relevant documents before Sitting down, she was direct, economical, and asked exactly the questions that mattered, in exactly the right sequence. The hallmark of an investigator who understands the domain she's working in and doesn't need it explained to her. From the beginning, I walked through my findings in order: layer inconsistencies, providence gap, AR match, and the financial structure I believed explained why this particular piece was being positioned for this particular exhibition. At this particular moment, she listened to all of it. Then, she opened a folder and set it on the table between us. "Miss Sterling, I need to tell you something. Hear me through completely before you respond." The folder contained 6 documents, 6 provenance certifications, all from the past 4 years, all attached to works I had assessed or partially treated during the years of my marriage. High-end pieces, significant valuations, legitimate-looking certification. Each document carried professional letterhead, with my name on it, a seal that approximated mine, a format that matched my actual correspondence, format closely enough to pass institutional scrutiny. Not one of them bore my actual signature. Not one of them represented work I had actually performed. My professional identity had been used systematically to legitimize the documentation of assets I had never examined, for investors who had relied on my credentials to make financial decisions I didn't know existed. There is a specific sensation when you identify a weight you've been carrying so long you had stopped registering it as separate from yourself. Not relief, not immediately, but the beginning of the process that eventually becomes relief. I set the folder down quietly. "Miss Sterling," O'Keefe said, "would you be willing to work with our office as a civilian advisory consultant, specifically concerning your professional assessment of the pieces involved and their documentation history?" "Tell me exactly what that means in practice," I said. She was specific. I listened carefully. I was present at the gallery's preview evening in July, finalizing documentation on the Impressionist piece. Genevieve Hurst arrived with her foundation's curatorial team. 3 people moving efficiently around her. The particular choreography of people accustomed to making a space work around one person's preferences. She came through the gallery with the unhurried confidence of someone used to rooms adjusting to their presence, rather than the other way around. We were in the same space for approximately 3 minutes. She did not see me, not because I was concealed, but because I existed in a category of the room that her attention did not require. I had spent 2 years with a version of Genevieve Hurst, assembled from fragments, from a name on a calendar, from a marina receipt, from the understanding that she had occupied the space in Alaric's life where I had been displaced. What I observed across that gallery was simply a person who moved through the world in a specific way, that she existed in spaces where other people became invisible. Was its own particular cruelty. It was also finally something I could set down later. Back in the studio, examining the painting's underlying structure. Under ultraviolet, I thought about the video segments I had filmed on heat, sensitive pigments, the compounds that require sustained heat to begin their migration. Slow and invisible at first, then irreversible once they've made it through the varnish layer. A shape formed somewhere at the periphery of my thinking. Not a plan, nothing with a name yet. Just a possibility that certain things buried inside a painting can, under the right conditions, and with the right technical knowledge, be made to announce themselves at exactly the moment the audience is assembled to see them. I left the thought where it was. Some ideas need room before they become decisions. I told Okafor I would consider her offer. I meant that genuinely. At home that night, the children asleep, I opened a forensic financial database. A member of Okafor's team had cleared me to access. For the scope of this consultation, it was a different kind of analysis than anything I had run before. Actual capital movement rather than declared positions. Following money through the structure, rather than reading the structure's surface. 30 minutes into the review, I closed the laptop and sat in the dark kitchen. For a long time, whatever I had believed that marriage was, Whatever I had concluded, Alaric's choices had been about, and for whom I was about to understand it, had been something fundamentally different, and considerably larger. September in San Francisco brings the warmth that people who don't live here assume we have all summer. Clear skies, light that goes golden earlier than expected, the particular quality of an afternoon that has decided to be generous with the city. I marked September of 2022, not by the weather, but by the number of times I sat across from someone, at a conference table, with a document. Between us I signed the advisory agreement with the DOJ. On a Tuesday morning, the federal building on Golden Gate Avenue has the specific institutional quality of all federal. The lobby, the elevator, the conference room, designed to communicate permanence without warmth. The agreement was specific in its scope, specific in its confidentiality provisions, and specific about the limitations of my function. Civilian advisory consultant on matters of provenance, authentication and cultural heritage assessment, working in a confidential capacity under Agent Alcifer's unit, not a law enforcement role. My name would appear on no public record of the proceedings. I initialed each page and signed the last one, with the same care I bring to condition reports. Okafor began with the full picture. Immediately after, the complete scope of what the unit had documented before making contact with me. The forged letterhead operation had begun no later than 2019. Someone within the financial structure around Vaughn Capital had obtained my professional correspondence formats and replicated my certification seal with sufficient precision to pass review at the institutional level. Falsified authenticity assessments bearing my name had been attached to provenance documentation for 14 pieces, 14 works I had never examined, 14 certifications I had never written. The combined declared valuation across the 14 works is approximately $42 million. She said. I sat with that number for a moment. Ms. Sterling, your professional standing is not in question. The investigation makes this clear. You had no knowledge of, and were not a party to any of this. The documentation fully supports that. I know. I said. I needed to hear the number. She gave me the timeline without softening it. Cases of this complexity, involving structured financial fraud, international provenance chains, and parallel asset investigations, across multiple jurisdictions, require between 18 months and 3 years to build, with the rigor necessary for a proceeding that holds. Moving early meant moving with incomplete evidence. It also meant showing their hand, before the full architecture of the operation had been mapped. We need you to maintain your external life exactly as it is, she said. Nothing changes on the surface until we say it does. I understood the patience this required. I'd been practicing it for 2 years. 3 days later I sat in an office on Fillmore Street across from Margaret Prescott, who specialized in probate and trust law, and came recommended by a colleague of my divorce attorney. The UCSF document specialists' written authentication report had arrived that week. 3 pages of technical analysis, confirming the paper composition, ink chemistry, and notarial seal as consistent with 1987 production, and entirely inconsistent with later fabrication. Margaret Prescott read the authentication, first methodically, then the document itself. She read it twice before setting it down, which told me what I needed to know. Before she said a word, the 1987 codicil was a formal amendment to the Vaughn Family Trust, drafted by Alaric's father, and executed through the family's private legal counsel, properly witnessed, properly notarized, filed with the trust, never, as far as the record indicated, incorporated into the operating documents the family had acted on. In practice its provision was legible and precise. In the event that any named heir of the Vaughn Family Trust was determined through medical or genetic evidence not to be a biological descendant of the trusts, grantor that heir's entitlement to trust assets would be rendered void from the date of such determination. The court of last cited a specific medical record, dated October 1986, referenced by file number attending physician and facility. It did not state the finding of that record directly. It didn't need to. A man writes a legal amendment to his family trust and cites a medical record from the previous year. The document is sufficient to understand what the record found. Alaric's father had known. He hadn't confronted it, perhaps couldn't bring himself to, or chose not to, or found the legal structure a more manageable expression of the truth than a direct one. But he had built a provision into the trust that would hold long after he was gone, waiting for the right circumstances to become consequential. What are my options? I asked. You can file this with the probate court and initiate a determination proceeding, Margaret said, which would trigger an immediate legal response from the vaunted state administrators and alert anyone with a material interest in the trust's composition to what you're holding. She paused. Or you can keep it until the surrounding conditions make its use more effective. Define effective. Until there's nothing to interrupt, she said, and nothing left to protect on the other side. I thought about what Okafor had told me 72 hours earlier. I thought about 18 months to 3 years. I thought about the specific logic of a well-constructed case. The reason you don't remove the most visible piece before the structure beneath it has been fully exposed. I'll hold it, I said. Diana was with the twins when I got home that evening. I thanked her and saw her out, then sat on the studio floor, while Theo and Iris moved through the last hour before bedtime, with the purposeful chaos of 20-month-olds, who have developed strong opinions about the order of things. Theo was stacking blocks in a structural formation I couldn't entirely follow, but which he was clearly committed to. Iris had been conducting an investigation of the space under the work table for 3 weeks now, moving objects in and out of it, according to a classification system of her own design. I sat among them and thought. I spent 3 years understanding the Vaughan family as a permanent structure, something established and solid, that I had entered without adequate credentials, and would leave diminished, and I was holding, in an archival envelope, in a fireproof box, on the shelf above my reference materials, a document written by a man I had never met, confirming that the foundation of that permanent structure had been a story, one the family had decided at some point to treat as architecture. The thought didn't produce triumph. It produced a very specific kind of quiet that felt like finally being able to see the room clearly after the children were asleep. I cleared the work surface and found the message I had been allowing to sit for 2 weeks. A preview invitation, minimal formal, unsigned except for a single initial H. A Pacific Heights address I didn't recognize. No context, no explanation. It had been sent to my professional email. The address connected to my restoration practice. Not my channel. Not any record attached to the marriage. Not anything public-facing. The address that existed before Alaric Vaughan, and had continued quietly through everything that had happened since. Someone had looked for that specific address. Someone had found it. I sat with the invitation in the studio quiet, and thought about what it meant, that the sender had chosen that channel. Professional, private, specific. Something in the quality of the choice told me that whoever had signed, with a single initial, and an unfamiliar Pacific Heights address, knew considerably more about the actual shape of my situation than they had a visible reason to know. I decided to go. The gallery occupied the ground floor of a Pacific Heights brownstone that had survived the 1906 earthquake, and appeared to have developed opinions about subsequent architecture that it kept to itself. No sign at the entrance, no hours posted. The kind of space that functions exclusively on the basis of people already knowing it exists. Inside 12 pieces, no more. Lit with the specific care of someone who understood that good light is not about brightness. It's about the angle at which a surface is allowed to speak. The works were international in scope, restrained in presentation, and entirely serious, in a register that didn't require announcing itself. I moved through them the way I move through any unfamiliar collection, slowly, without agenda. A staff member offered me a glass of water and withdrew. A minute later a man came through the back. 60 approximately. There is a particular quality to authority that people who genuinely possess it develop over time, as opposed to authority performed by people who need others to confirm it. He moved without ceremony, without the practiced social architecture of a man accustomed to making entrances. He introduced himself with the directness of someone picking up a conversation rather than starting one. I'm Edward Hurst. Genevieve is my daughter. I looked at him. He looked back, with the measured patience of someone who has delivered this specific piece of information before, and had a reliable sense of the range of responses it tended to produce. I said nothing. He gestured toward 2 chairs near the rear of the gallery. The chairs had been placed there deliberately, which told me this portion of the meeting had been organized in advance. I sat down. I'm going to be direct with you. He said, I think that's the version of this conversation you'd prefer. You'd be right, I said. He began with the financial layer. That told me something accurate about his priorities. In 2019, Hearst Media had entered a co-investment agreement with Von Capital. The agreement contained a standard exit provision, what the document called a material misrepresentation by fund management clause, which would allow Hearst to withdraw without incurring the penalty obligations that a standard unilateral exit would trigger. By 2021, Hearst's financial analysts had developed a clear view that Von Capital's reported asset valuations bore no honest relationship to the fund's actual financial position. The problem was evidentiary. To invoke the misrepresentation clause, they needed documented evidence of fraud, evidence that originated from an independent source, not from Hearst's own competing financial interests, not from an investigation Hearst had commissioned, not from anyone who could be characterized as a self-interested party. Your professional letterhead was forged, I said, and attached to provenance certifications for assets in the Von Capital portfolio, which makes me an independent third party who was materially deceived. Not a Hearst associate, not a competing investor, a conservator with no stake in Von Capital's performance, who was used without her knowledge. That's the most useful version of what happened to you. He said, from my position, yes. And the first reason, yes, there are 3. The second was strategic. He needed a credible, independent public presence, capable of applying visible pressure to the Von Capital situation, one that wouldn't appear to originate from the Hearst organization. A direct move from Hearst against Alaric carried the obvious problem, given that Genevieve was involved with Alaric. Any Hearst-originated attack would be characterized as a personal or family dispute, rather than a documented business grievance. What he needed was a voice, with no visible Hearst connection, with a direct, professional relationship to the specific fraud, and with a platform sufficient to make the conversation publicly consequential. If that became necessary, I needed someone already standing adjacent to the problem, he said, with the professional credibility to be believed. When they described what it looked like from the inside, the third layer he covered quickly, as if he'd assessed exactly how much weight it deserved, and calibrated his phrasing accordingly. Genevieve needs to learn certain things about how value is actually built. Watching what happens to Alaric Vaughan, and observing the contrast with someone who built something real, is a more instructive lesson than any conversation I could manufacture. But this is the least significant of the 3 motivations. I include it because it's honest. I looked at him. You invested in me because I was useful to you. Correct, he said. The initial distribution, the accounts that amplified your first video into the major art communities, that was a Hearst Media operation. My team gave you 40,000 people in the first week. Your channel has 14 million subscribers now. We provided the initial 40,000. You built the remaining 136 million without our involvement. I can work with that, I said, as long as we're both clear about what this arrangement is and what it isn't. Something shifted in his, not warmth, more precise than that. the specific recognition of a person who has received the response they were hoping for, rather than the one they anticipated. His proposal was a series of international exhibition events, a curatorial partnership between my professional restoration practice and a consortium of galleries affiliated with the Hearst Foundation's Cultural Programming Network. The anchor was a major San Francisco exhibition spring 2024, a cultural property showcase provenance-verified works, restoration histories, as part of the curatorial narrative, documentation as the story rather than the footnote, the centerpiece. He told me with the economy of someone who doesn't need to repeat himself, would be the large, impressionist canvas, currently under my restoration assessment at the Hayes Valley Gallery. I heard the complete proposal. I was simultaneously listening for something else. The painting I was assessing for the DOJ. The painting that had matched an Interpol theft notification from 1993. The painting Alaric needed exhibited at a prestigious international venue to validate it as collateral for a European bridge loan. The same painting Edward Hearst was now proposing as the centerpiece of an exhibition his foundation would organize and publicize. That alignment was not a coincidence. It was a position someone had constructed. The question was how long ago it had been constructed, and with what level of specific knowledge. You already knew what that painting actually is. I said, not a question. Edward Hearst was quiet for a moment. The particular quiet of a man who has determined that saying nothing constitutes the most honest and precise answer available. That was his answer. I told him I needed to verify several things before committing to anything. He said that was exactly the response he expected, and handed me a card with a direct line, not an assistant's number, his own. I walked out onto the November street. The air was the particular cold of a San Francisco November. Not sharp, not aggressive, just present and patient. The brownstone behind me looked exactly as it had before I went in. Buildings like that don't acknowledge what happens inside them. I stood on the sidewalk and thought about the board I had understood myself to be playing on for 2 years. Me and Alaric, his family on one side. What I saw now was different in scale, and considerably different in composition. There were positions occupied before I entered any of this. Pieces placed in anticipation of how someone, in my specific situation, would respond to specific pressures. Someone had been watching long enough to stake something on my trajectory. The question was whether I was willing to play inside the space. That bet had opened for me. I got into my car and called Okafor. Do you know who Edward Hearst is? A pause. That name has come up. Not a full answer. He just told me he knows about the Interpol painting. He knows what it actually is. He positioned that exhibition deliberately. A longer pause. Where are you right now? My car, Pacific Heights. Don't commit to anything he's proposed, she said. Not in the next 48 hours. Why 48 hours? Because we need to have a fuller conversation first. A beat. There's something I should have told you last month. I want to do it in person. The line went quiet. The 48 hours Okafor requested stretched into a week. Then 2 weeks. Then the full month of December. A period of careful, deliberate movement that looked from outside like nothing happening at all. In my experience, that is the only kind of movement that actually changes things. The full conversation with Okafor happened in person, in the Federal Building conference room. I had come to know by the sound of the HVAC system, and the particular quality of afternoon light through the windows. She told me what she had and said. In November the DOJ had been tracking Edward Hearst as a potential witness to Von Capital's operational structure, not as a subject of investigation, but as a documented source. His position as an investor made him privy to information the unit needed. When I described our Pacific Heights meeting, she'd already had his outline. What she hadn't known was how he'd framed his approach. To me, that's what I needed to understand, she said. Now I do. The terms were simple. I could proceed with the gallery partnership under one condition. Any substantive communication with Hearst, touching on the investigation subject matter, was to be reported to her unit within 24 hours. I was to operate as exactly what I was: a professional conservator, engaged in a legitimate curatorial project. Nothing more, nothing less. I agreed without hesitation. The gallery agreement was signed in early December. An international cultural property exhibition series, with the anchor event, at San Francisco's Moscone Center, in April 2024. A coalition of European institutions, 11 organizations from 6 countries, had committed to loans and representation. My formal designation: lead conservator and provenance specialist for the centerpiece work. I signed the document with full understanding that it was one piece of a structure I still couldn't see in its complete form. That was intentional, both theirs and mine. Diana became my studio manager that same month. The title had been accurate in practice for over a year. She managed transport logistics, scheduling, sponsor correspondence, and the structural operations of a professional practice that had grown beyond what I could run alone. From December, she received a formal salary, drawn from channel revenue. You need a title on the accounting side, I told her. Studio manager works. She said, don't make it a moment. The controlled property exposure order arrived on a Thursday, in late December, authorized by a federal magistrate on Agent Osifer's recommendation. I want to be precise about what this is. Under the federal statutes governing identified stolen cultural property, the DOJ can secure court authorization for specific, closely supervised modifications to an illegally trafficked item, when those modifications serve a defined evidentiary function to reveal the item's fraudulent nature before a qualified international audience, whose professional testimony would be admissible in federal proceedings. The order is narrow, specific, and conditional. It is not standard. It existed in this case because of the particular circumstances. A painting already matched to an Interpol theft report, already positioned for a major international exhibition, already central to an active federal fraud investigation. The heat-reactive pigment compounds, applied in the final varnish layer, under controlled conditions, remain chemically stable under standard gallery environments, under the high-intensity, sustained lighting of a major international exhibition, the kind the Moscow event would deploy. They begin their migration after 8 to 12 weeks of sustained exposure to exhibition-level lighting, intensity threshold, that standard storage and gallery environments do not reach. The timeline placed the visible result precisely at the opening of the April 2024 event in front of curators, provenance specialists, and to institutional representatives from 11 countries who could serve as expert witnesses. I applied the compound alone in the studio on a Saturday afternoon in late December. The city outside was doing its ordinary December things. Inside, I worked with the same steadiness I bring to every session. I want to be honest with you about this moment, because I think honesty is the only way to tell it accurately. I have spent 15 years working to prevent exactly this category of damage. This is the only time in my professional life I caused it deliberately. The justifications are all valid. A court order exists. The painting belongs to no innocent owner. It was stolen property with a 30-year Interpol record, and the fraud that surrounded it had used my professional identity without my knowledge or consent. For years, all of that is true. What is also true is that setting that brush down felt different from every other time I've set a brush down. I stayed with that for a while before I cleaned my tools. I needed to make sure the difference between with authorization and for justified cause, and just because the cause is right, hadn't disappeared on me in that hour. It hadn't. I cleaned the brushes carefully the way I always do. And I went home. Sybil Vaughan's attorney reached my attorney in the 3rd week of December. Dibble had acquired a historically significant document from the estate's archival records. She wanted professional authentication and valuation to support a private sale. She wanted my credentials on the certification. I thought about it for approximately 90 seconds. Then I told my attorney to draft the service agreement. The contract was 2 pages of standard professional services language. On page 3, in provisions that were accurate and accurate sounding and easy to overlook when you were reading. For the contract's primary purpose was this: any document reviewed under the scope of this agreement that the consulting party determined to bear potential legal significance would be subject to mandatory evidence preservation protocols consistent with the consulting party's professional and ethical obligations. Sybil's attorney held the contract for 48 hours, returned it signed without red lines. We met at a neutral office. In the second week of January, Sybil sat across the table and directed every remark through the attorneys, as though I were an instrument, rather than a participant, which had always been her preferred approach to me, and which felt on that particular afternoon almost sentimental. The document she submitted was not the 1987 cottage. It was a different estate. Record minor historical interest, nothing actionable. She had come looking for a professional certification. She had signed a document, giving me contractual grounds to retain anything she brought to any future consultation. She hadn't read page 3. The year-end video went up in late December. Diana helped frame the shots. She had developed real precision about what the channel's audience responded to. When we finished, she looked at the monitor. "You look different than you did 8 months ago." She said different how? Like someone who knows exactly where they're going. By the end of January, 3 things were in. A painting that would not survive its own exhibition. Intact, a legal document binding the Vaughan family to terms they hadn't examined carefully. And a federal case building toward a date I didn't yet know. The 4th thing, the thing none of us had anticipated, arrived on a Thursday afternoon in February. A voicemail I almost didn't open. The voicemail arrived at 3:47 on a Thursday afternoon. I was mid-setup for a filming session. Lights positioned, piece on the work surface. The specific, preparatory quiet that precedes a recording. The phone vibrated on the table beside my equipment. The caller ID showed 12 zeros and nothing else. Not a blocked number. Not unknown. 12 zeros. Which is a different category of signal entirely. My threshold for answering unidentified calls has its own logic. Most are noise. A few are problems. Almost none are worth stopping a session for. I set down the camera arm, picked up the phone, and opened the voicemail. 22 seconds. I played it once. Set the phone face up on the work table. Looked at the ceiling. Played it again. The recording was a segment cut from a longer file. You could hear the background acoustics of a conference room, the sound deadened quality of a corporate meeting space, the particular quality of a microphone picking up a room rather than an individual. The voice needed no confirmation. Frankly, those children were never part of any plan for this fund. They are a liability, a waste of current capital. Genevieve understands that. She's not sentimental about efficiency. Alaric Vaughan measured, confident in the specific register of a man, addressing people whose approval he wants. A register I had known across 4 years, and could identify in the first syllable. I sat with it, not in shock. I was past the kind of shock that produces visible stillness. What I was sitting with was something else. The particular quiet of a person who has just received the piece that makes everything else's shape clear, and who needs a moment to take in the view. I sent the file to Diana with 2 words. Authenticate this. Diana's professional network includes forensic audio specialists she had worked with across years of documentary and commercial production. They ran the file over 72 hours. The analysis covered file structure, integrity, metadata, timestamp verification, acoustic frequency characteristics, consistent with the documented recording environment, and voice pattern analysis, cross-referenced against publicly available recordings of Alaric Vaughan in verifiable settings, conference presentations, an archived media interview from 2019, 2 clips from investor events. The result was unambiguous. The file was unaltered. The embedded metadata placed its creation at approximately 18 months prior, consistent with a corporate meeting in mid-2021. The voice characteristics matched the reference samples within the margin required for professional identification. In legal proceedings, The recording was authentic. I called Okafor. She was quiet through my account of the contents. Then send it to the unit's secure upload channel. Don't forward it anywhere before then. She called back 4 hours later. The signal path traces back to Hearst Media's corporate recording infrastructure. She said Edward Hearst had preserved that recording through his compliance division and had chosen this particular moment to release it directly to me. The meeting took place at their San Francisco headquarters, a capital allocation presentation by Von Capital to Hearst's investment division in mid-2021. And the recording consent, I said, every person who enters the Hearst Media building to present to their investment group signs a standard corporate recording consent agreement. At the entrance, the building uses a documented recording system for compliance and security purposes. This is disclosed in writing prominently, and the signature is required before entry is permitted. Ulrich Vaughn signed that document the morning of the meeting. This matters, and I want to explain why precisely. Under California Penal Code 632, the state's two-party consent law, recording a confidential communication without the knowledge and consent of all parties is not permitted. What makes a corporate consent agreement different from covert surveillance is the disclosure. Alaric knew he was entering a building with an active recording system. He signed an acknowledgement of that. His consent was documented, witnessed and retained in Hearst's compliance files. The recording is not a secret. It is a corporate record, created with full disclosed consent. The file is legally clean. O'Keefe said. Hearst's legal team is precise about California law. They knew exactly what they were preserving, and exactly what it was worth. As a compliance document, they transferred it to us, with the full chain of custody intact. Every hand it moved through, every timestamp. I thought about the 12 zeros on the caller ID, the specific routing of the file to me, before it entered the official record. He wanted me to understand it before it became part of the case. I said that's the most accurate interpretation. Okafor said, I'll leave the implications of that with you. The automatic hold notification came through my attorney the following week. Sybil's full advisory agreement, signed in January without red lines, with the evidence preservation clause sitting on page 3 in language that required reading for its own sake, rather than the contract's primary purpose, had now triggered its operative provision. The documents submitted during January's consultation had been formally flagged by the court as potentially material to an active proceeding. An automatic legal hold was now in place on the associated estate assets. No transfer, sale or modification permitted until the hold was reviewed and lifted. Sybil Von had walked into that agreement voluntarily, with full legal representation, and find herself into a position that neither she nor her attorney had fully read. The production inquiry came through Diana, who filtered all incoming media and commercial outreach, a producer from Women, who rebuilt a live broadcast program with a documented distribution of 41 million concurrent viewers, wanted to know if I'd discuss professional reinvention on their March episode. I met the producer at her office. She was warm, direct and genuinely interested in the channel's arc. We covered the segment format, the structure, the timing. At the end of the meeting I asked one question. Can I bring a short audio clip? It relates directly to what I'll be talking about. She looked pleased. Of course, testimonials, client feedback. We use that format all the time. It adds texture. Something like that. I said that evening. Theo was asleep before the end of the second sentence. About solvent ratios. Reliable as ever. Iris lay looking at me, with those eyes that have always processed more than they announce. I sat at the edge of her mattress in the low light and watched her watch me. What I'm about to do, I said quietly, I'm doing for you. Because no version of the future I was willing to build included a world where two people I had brought into it were permitted to be called a liability, without an answer, without a record, without consequences, proportionate to what was said, casually in a conference room, to people whose approval was being sought, about children who were sleeping 200 miles away, and had no idea they were being discussed. Not once, not ever again. The program was scheduled for March 15. I asked Diana to come with me. She said yes immediately without asking why. Which is precisely why Diana is irreplaceable. And precisely why she has been present at every significant thing that has happened in my life. For the past 2 years, the weeks between that agreement and March were genuinely quiet, not anxious, not sleepless in the way I might have expected. What I felt most nights was something I had no more precise word for than readiness, the very specific, very still sensation of standing at the edge of something you have spent 2 years constructing, understanding that the moment to move forward has arrived and that you are finally ready to move. The studio was smaller than I had expected. All the light was concentrated on a precise rectangle of floor and furniture. And beyond that boundary, the room fell into a working dark of equipment, cases and crew members in headsets, who moved quietly at the margins, as though operating in a different gravity than the lit space at the center. I had watched this on television my entire life. In person it had the quality of very specific, very deliberate theater. I had made breakfast for the twins before the morning sitter arrived. Oatmeal with pears, Theo's current preference. Iris required the pears served in a separate bowl, at a distance of approximately 4 inches from the oatmeal, a parameter she maintained with the seriousness of a professional standard. I kissed both of them on the top of the head. I picked up my bag, which contained the secure device, with the audio file inside, the same way I'd pick up my equipment case for a studio commission. Just another morning almost. Diana sat beside me in the green room, while the crew performed its pre-broadcast preparations. The makeup artist worked. Diana read something on her phone. The room maintained the specific quiet of a room in which something is about to happen that everyone is pretending is ordinary. "You good?" she said once we were alone. "I've been ready for this for 2 years," I said. She nodded, went back to her phone. That was exactly the right response. Which is why Diana is Diana. Rachel Holloway, the program's host, had done genuine research. She could reference specific restoration pieces I had discussed publicly, could ask intelligent questions about the consolidation methods for a damaged Flemish piece I'd featured the previous December. She was warm in the precise, unhurried way that takes 20 years of live television to develop. The first portion of the conversation was on my ground entirely. 21 million people watching someone restore paintings. She said, "What do you think they're actually watching?" "I think they're watching the idea that things can come back from damage." I said, "That's what the channel actually is. Underneath the technique, people respond to that." She nodded, shifted. "You've spoken in interviews about a period of significant personal difficulty that overlapped with the channel's early growth. Without asking you to go further than you'd like, what was the hardest single moment?" I had not rehearsed a word of what I was about to say. I knew it completely. "The hardest moment," I said, "was understanding that the person I had trusted most had described our children to his business partners in a professional meeting as a waste of existing capital." Something moved across Rachel Holloway's face. The specific shift of someone who had prepared for a certain emotional radius and found themselves outside it. That's a devastating thing to learn. I didn't hear it in real time. I said I received a recording made through Hearst Media's standard corporate documentation system, legally obtained, with all parties' consent documented and verified. I'd like to play it now if the program will allow. I have the file with me. From the control room, through the floor manager's earpiece, came the producer's voice. The floor manager looked at me, nodded. I placed the device on the table, connected its output to the program's audio system, pressed play. 22 seconds. Frankly, those children were never part of any plan for this fund. They're a liability, a waste of current capital. Genevieve understands that. She's not sentimental about efficiency. The studio went completely still. Rachel Holloway took 3 full seconds. In live television, that is a very long time. "That voice is that your former husband. Yes, I said, that is Elric Vaughn. He manages the Vaughn Capital Fund in San Francisco. Those are his exact words. In a recorded corporate meeting about our children. The rest of the interview I completed with the same care I bring to work. In difficult condition. Steady hands, no excess movement. Rachel asked her questions. I answered them accurately and without embellishment. She was professional. The conversation closed. I stood in the hallway backstage. Diana's hand closed on my arm and held it. We walked out into the street together. Neither of us said anything for the first 2 minutes. The city was carrying on around us. In its ordinary Thursday manner. The air was cold. And the sun was at the angle it goes to in mid-March. Flat and indirect and present. By 11:30 the clip was live across every platform. By 4:00 in the afternoon. 3 institutional investors, with documented positions in Vaughn Capital, had issued public statements. By 8 that evening, the fund had experienced a 60% reduction in pledged capital commitments, the kind of number that ends conversations about recovery within 48 hours. A network calling itself the Clean Art Coalition, organized without any instruction from me, by people I had never communicated with, had made contact across 17 institutions and galleries, with documented connections to Vaughn Capital linked assets. 3 issued formal public statements. 2 terminated affiliations without explanation, the way institutions do when they want the exit, without the record of the conversation. O'Keefe called at 9:00. Miss Sterling, she said, the timeline has accelerated. We're moving to the next phase. I told her I understood. We agreed to speak in the morning. At home Theo slept, with the depth of someone who had expended the full available energy of a 2-year-old, and was replenishing it systematically. Iris was awake on her back in the crib, looking at the ceiling, with the deliberate stillness she brought to things. She was processing. I sat on the floor beside her, and spoke quietly into the lamplight room. He called you a liability, I said. When you're old enough to understand what that means. I want you to know that he was wrong about everything. Every single thing he said. Iris looked at the ceiling, then at me, then she closed her eyes. 2 hours later my phone rang. Unknown number. I answered. Valerie. A woman's voice. Careful, slightly rehearsed at the edges. The way a voice sounds when someone has decided what they're going to say before they dial. This is Genevieve Hurst. I think we need to talk. I didn't ask how she had gotten my number. Some things are better understood than explained. I called Genevieve Hurst back the following morning. From my kitchen. While both children were in high chairs. Eating scrambled eggs. Maintaining the ordinary rhythm of my day. During that conversation felt, for reasons I couldn't entirely articulate, like something essential. She answered on the second ring. Thank you for calling back. She said, which told me she hadn't been certain I would. You had something I should know, I said. Tell me. Her voice carried the quality of someone accustomed to being listened to. But underneath it, the way a restorer learns to hear things. Beneath the surface, something had shifted. The composure was intact. The assumption beneath it was gone. The fund is finished, she said. Not damaged, finished. What I wanted you to know, because I don't think you'll hear this from anyone but me, is that the 22 million Elric moved offshore 2 years ago. Isn't there? It hasn't been there for 14 months. Theo was examining a piece of egg that had landed on his tray, with the focused concern he brings to structural problems. Iris was watching me. I kept my voice level. So where is it? My father's compliance team identified irregularities in the account. Immediately after Alaric set it up, they reported to FinCEN, the Federal Financial Crimes Enforcement Division. The account was frozen under a regulatory hold 14 months ago. Every dollar, she explained, the rest in plain terms. Alaric's access portal, his login, his balance display, his transaction interface, continued showing his full balance. After the freeze, the regulators maintained the display deliberately. Every transaction he attempted against a frozen account generated additional, documented evidence of his intentions. He had been looking at a number that didn't exist, making decisions based on it, and providing the investigation with a complete behavioral record. Every time he tried to use money that was no longer his, he checked the balance, she said, saw what he expected to see, never considered verifying any further. I want to explain this to you clearly, because the mechanism has a name. In the world of financial fraud investigation, it's called a ghost balance, a portal display, deliberately maintained to show a subject their money, while the account sits frozen behind it. Ulrich had built his entire bridge loan strategy, his entire confidence going into the fund's collapse, his entire calculation about what he had available, when everything else failed, on a number that had been a ghost for over a year. There is a specific terrible precision in that. This was a man who had spent years building systems, designed to make surfaces look different from what was underneath them. He had never once considered that the same thing could be done to him. He believed the number because he wanted to believe it. He never looked beneath. One more thing, Genevieve said. I didn't love him. I need you to know that. I never had illusions about who Ulrich Vaughn is. The choices I made are mine, and I won't pretend otherwise. But the version of this you may have been living with, what you might have imagined about what I was to him, I want to correct it. I worked that out. I said, a pause. I'm sorry for the part one played in it. That was what she had. It was, I decided, sufficient. The call ended. Iris had finished her eggs, and was looking at me, with the expression she uses when she has processed a situation completely, and is waiting for me to catch up. Let's get you cleaned up, I said. My attorney filed the 1987 codicil with the San Francisco probate court. That week, within 24 hours, O'Keefe called to confirm what we had already discussed. The estate court filing had been received by the DOJ investigation team as a parallel proceeding, and the biological descendants' challenge to Ulrich's standing on the Vaughn family trust was now part of the official record. Both sets of attorneys, his and the estates, were notified simultaneously. I thought about what that morning's correspondence must have meant for Sybil Vaughn. I didn't allow myself to linger on it too long. The advisory service contract Sybil had signed in January, with its evidence preservation clause on page 3, returned without red lines by her own legal representation, activated fully by the end of March. The estate documents she had submitted were under a court-mandated hold. Her attorney had no authority to access or transfer them. The combination of the biological challenge and the advisory hold placed the complete Vaughn estate portfolio in legal freeze. No transfers, no access, no movement of any kind. By April, the full picture was the fund was gone. Its offshore account had been empty for 14 months. The estate was frozen pending a paternity determination, and every financial instrument the Vaughn family controlled was under some form of legal hold. Diana called on a Tuesday. So everything over there is basically on fire, she said. Everything they built on someone else's foundation. I said, that's poetic and terrifying both at once. I said yes. What none of us had anticipated was that Ulrich had not stopped. 2 weeks later there was a knock at my door. When I opened it, I understood something that perhaps should have been obvious from the beginning. Some people will not accept the ending that reality has prepared for them. They come to your door, they press a hand against the frame, and they try to write a different one themselves. It was a Sunday afternoon in May, when Ulrich Vaughn appeared at the entrance of my building. I know it was a Sunday, because I had just come back from the Ferry Building farmers market, with both children, Theo completely asleep, against my shoulder, with the specific dead weight of a 2-year-old, who has calculated that if he shuts down entirely, someone will carry him the rest of the way. And Iris sitting in the stroller in the focused, contained fury of someone who objects strenuously to being in a stroller, but does not yet have the institutional authority to do anything about it. I saw him before he saw me. He was standing near the entrance, with the posture of a person who had arrived at a location and was now uncertain whether the plan assembled for this moment was actually sufficient. He looked older than he was. The suit was expensive. It would always be expensive. in the way that certain things remain expensive, even after the person wearing them has stopped being able to afford what they represent. But it sat on him differently. The way that a well-made suit sits on a person who no longer quite fills the space their own life used to occupy. He turned, saw me, approached. He asked if we could go upstairs. No, I said. I engaged the brake on the stroller with my foot. His first attempt was the recognizable one, the approach that invokes shared history and the pressure of circumstances, with the implicit suggestion that you should extend grace to the person responsible for the damage, because their own experience of creating it was difficult. I know what I did was there was a tremendous amount of pressure. At the time, the fun my mother, there was so many. Alaric, I said, just his name. He stopped. His second attempt reached for the children, which I had expected. They are my children too. Whatever happened between us? You placed a $500 check on a courtroom table, I said, and described them as a waste of current capital. The court transcripts record that. The word waste is in the document. The word was exact. He had heard it before in his own voice, through a television audio system, in front of 4 million people. He was hearing it now, at a distance of approximately 8 feet, delivered without emphasis as a matter of record. The distance between those two experiences registered on his face, in the specific way that things register when there is nothing left to say about them. His third attempt started to reach towards something. That was not a request. I don't know what you're doing with the attorneys, or with whoever you've been working with, but pulling these threads is not going to end well for. Stop, I said, single syllable, no elevation in tone. He stopped. I'm taking the children upstairs. You should go home. I released the stroller brake and turned toward the building entrance. Behind me, he spoke my name once more. Valerie, you used to be someone I could talk to. I turned back and looked at him once, directly for the last time, in a way that took in the whole of what was standing there. The suit, the posture, the particular quality of a person who has used up all their remaining options and doesn't yet fully understand that. You used to be someone worth talking to. I said, good evening, Alaric. I went inside. I did not look back. Upstairs, I settled Theo on his nap mat and gave Iris a bowl of cereal for her ongoing project of sorting objects by criteria I have yet to fully map. Then I called Okafor. I reported the encounter in sequence, what he said in what order, as close to exact phrasing as I could reconstruct. 3 distinct approaches in under 5 minutes. The third had moved toward implied threat. Before he caught himself. Did he threaten you directly? He began to and stopped. The intention was present. Write everything down tonight. Exact words where you have them. General content elsewhere. Time and duration. His physical and emotional state. A pause. Valerie. We're 10 to 11 months from the Moscow exhibition. The case is complete. We move when the painting goes on display. This afternoon goes into the record. I told her I understood. That evening, I typed the incident report, read it through once, and sent it to her secure channel. Then I made tea and stood at the kitchen window, while the city outside arranged itself, the way San Francisco does on a Sunday evening. The light going amber at the last angle. The fog, beginning its slow patient arrival from the west, as if it has always been doing this, and will continue to do so, regardless of anything occurring on the human scale. Below it on the wall beside the studio doorway, the calendar, one date marked in red, placed there when I signed the Moscow Center agreement in December 2022. April 2024. Not circled in dread, not in impatience. Circled because it was the destination, the single fixed point, that everything else had been oriented toward, since I first understood what that painting actually was and what my specific position, expertise and evidence made possible. I was not afraid of it. I had been building toward it carefully, for a very long time. There is one skill I have, that I am genuinely confident in, beyond the restoration work itself. I am very good at waiting. In the 11 months between May 2023 and April 2024, I told Diana afterward, I did the most ordinary things I had ever done. In my life I completed a Flemish still life from 1680. I filmed 63 videos. I watched Theo teach himself to read in the specific, idiosyncratic order of a child, who has decided the conventional sequence is optional, and probably unnecessary. I watched Iris refuse to learn anything at all, until she was certain she could do it without error, and then do it without error. On the first attempt, I turned 38 and I let April come without once letting my hands shake. In January 2024, Okafor's unit formally designated me Senior Cultural Heritage Advisor to the DOJ Art Crime Division, a title with no public profile, no ceremonies, no announcement. For 3 months, I spent every available hour that wasn't filming, or studio work, or reading to the twins, completing the evidentiary record with her team. Every forged document cross-referenced and dated, every provenance chain documented, every gap in the record filled. By the time we were finished there were no gaps left. The morning of the Moscow Center opening, I arrived early. My name was on the official curatorial documentation, as lead certified conservator for the centerpiece work, the same name that had been placed without my knowledge on 14 fraudulent provenance certifications, now appeared on one that I had actually signed. The opening drew exactly the audience it was designed for: institutional directors, international curators, press from 6 countries, and the specific category of financial journalists who attend art events when the art is functioning primarily as capital. The Hearst Foundation's name appeared on the sponsorship panel near the main entrance. Genevieve was not in the room. The Hearst legal team had formally separated her from this exhibition by name in writing months before. I stood near a column, at a distance from the centerpiece canvas, and waited 2 hours after the opening, under the sustained, high-intensity lighting that a venue, the scale of Moscow, deploys for major international shows. The process began. It announced itself quietly: a slight irregularity in the varnish surface, a quality of the lights, returned from a section of the lower right quarter that was not consistent with the surrounding area. A conservator from a Brussels institution leaned closer, took a photograph, took another, called a colleague over without words. Over the next 40 minutes, what was occurring became impossible to categorize as anything other than what it was. The surface was exhibiting deterioration in a pattern that corresponded to no legitimate restoration process, and no natural degradation pathway. A migration through the varnish layer that followed, a distribution no accident could produce. International professionals began documenting the changes on their own equipment. The word provenance appeared in conversations around the piece with increasing frequency, and then Interpol, and then a silence moved through that section of the room, the way silence moves through a professional gathering when the people in it have collectively understood something and are each waiting to see who will say it first. Okafor's team had been in position since the doors opened. They moved through the gallery now with the complete, unhurried efficiency of people executing a plan that has been prepared across 18 months and does not require improvisation. Alaric was near the eastern exit, in conversation with a representative from a European private bank. He had come because he still believed, because some part of him had never stopped believing, that the bridge loan could be recovered, that the exhibition would validate the painting's value before any audit moved fast enough to reach him. He had never seriously considered that the painting might not survive its own opening day. He turned as the room's energy changed around him. His eyes moved, took in the cluster of bodies pressing toward the deteriorating canvas, took in Okafor's team crossing the floor with purpose, and then stopped at me, against the column on the opposite side of the room. I did not look away. He looked exactly the way a painting looks when you finally hold it under the correct light and understand that it was never what it claimed to be. Not destroyed, not broken, simply exposed. The surface in the accurate light, showing you the truth it had always held. Okafor reached him 30 seconds later. I left the Moscow Center 30 minutes after that and called Diana from the car. She answered immediately, said nothing, and waited because she has always understood precisely what a particular kind of moment requires, and what it does not. On Market Street, I passed a large LED billboard, cycling through local news. The current frame, the impressionist canvas, invisible deterioration, with a photograph beneath it. Von Capital Fund Director Ulrich Vaughan, taken into federal custody. The billboard cycled. The next. Tonight Women's Leadership Forum Live. My photograph submitted 2 months ago. When I confirmed my participation, my face the size of a building wall. Above the road. I had driven alone in the dark from the hospital. On the night Iris stopped breathing. And there had been 41 missed calls on my phone. I didn't cry, I kept driving. I arrived at the venue with 7 minutes to spare. Diana was already inside with both children. The woman at the entrance found my name in the list and looked up. "Miss Sterling," she said, "they're ready for you." I walked through the door and thought, I'm ready too. The ceremony hall was warm and full of the sound of 200 people who were genuinely pleased to be in the same room with each other. I had attended events like this during the years with Alaric, and they had always carried the quality of a performance. I was watching from an incorrect angle. Tonight felt different. Tonight felt like mine. Diana was in the 3rd row with both children. Iris was wearing the dress from the Restoration themed children's line I had launched 6 months earlier, a detail that produced in me a specific, private satisfaction that had nothing to do with revenue. Leo spotted me and began waving, with the full body commitment of a 3-year-old who has decided subtlety is optional. Iris looked at me with those precise eyes of hers, as if conducting a rapid assessment of whether I had earned the occasion. 3 other awards were presented. I watched them with genuine attention. When the host reached my category, Outstanding Achievement in Creative and Cultural Preservation, and as of today, Senior Cultural Heritage Advisor to the DOJ Art Crime Division, the room shifted. In the way rooms shift when they've received information they haven't fully processed yet. I walked to the stage. I spoke for 3 minutes. Not about Alaric. Not about courtrooms or evidence, or years of careful preparation. I talked about a painting, not the one at Moscow. Not the Interpol canvas. A small study I had with me. In the hospital waiting room. The night Iris stopped breathing. In the 2 hours before. The doctor came back out with news. The one thing I could control in a night that had none. That's where I learned how to do things correctly. I said one careful layer at a time. The host returned to the microphone after me and explained that tonight, in her capacity as DOJ Senior Advisor, Valerie Sterling would be making a brief, official statement. I came back to the podium. The room was very quiet. I stated that the DOJ Art Crime Division, following an 18-month investigation into Vaughan Capital Fund management practices and related cultural property violations, had received a court-authorized seizure order covering all remaining Vaughan family assets, and that federal agents were executing that order across multiple properties in San Francisco. At this moment, I thanked Agent O'Keefe by name. I thanked her team by function. I stepped back. I went and sat beside Diana. She handed me a glass of water without saying anything. Okafor called 20 minutes later. Vaughan is being transferred from Civic Center. He's requested 5 minutes. You're nearby. Your call entirely. 3 seconds. Tell him I'll come out. The federal vehicles were parked along the curb. Alaric was in the center. One door open, an agent standing at the frame. The suit was still immaculate, which would be the last Vaughan detail that surprised me. He said the things I had anticipated, that he hadn't intended for it to go this far, that he had never meant harm to the children, that if he had known. I waited until he finished completely. Alaric, I said quietly, you're right about one thing. I'm a restorer. My entire professional life is built on understanding what can be brought back and what cannot. That painting tonight, it was always going to fail. The damage had gone too deep too long ago. What you did to me, to your children, to every person who trusted you with their money, I cannot restore that. Those were decisions made again and again. Each time you had the option to choose differently. I reached into my jacket pocket. An envelope prepared weeks ago. I placed it on the seat beside him. $500 what you placed on a courtroom table. When I asked what our children were worth. I'm returning it. Buy yourself whatever dignity is still available. Because beginning tomorrow, you will not be in a position to share the same air as my children. I stepped back, looked at him one final time. The car door closed, I went inside. Theo was standing just inside the entrance, with the particular urgency of someone who has witnessed a significant event and cannot wait another moment. Mom Iris stole a bread roll from the people at the next table. I looked at Iris. She was holding the bread roll with the serene composure of someone who has done nothing, requiring a defense. I laughed, a real one, complete, uncomplicated, carrying none of the weight of the last 6 hours. I took the bread roll, returned it to its table with a brief apology, and picked up Iris and held her. Diana appeared at my elbow. Let's take your kids home in the car. Thea was asleep before we reached the end of the block. Iris lasted 4 more minutes, fighting it with those stubborn eyes before conceding. I drove through San Francisco at night. Here is what I want you to know. I spent 3 years restoring my own life, with the same patience I bring to every damaged, removing what was false, reinforcing what was sound, working with what actually existed, rather than what I had hoped it to be. I did not do it perfectly. I did not do it alone. Diana drove me to hospitals, studios and ceremonies, and asked for nothing in return that I wasn't already glad to give. Okafor trusted me with a case that required precision. In the exact moments I most wanted to act. From pure anger. Leo held my hand. Iris looked at me and decided I was reliable. And I have tried every single day since, to be exactly that. I parked the car, lifted Iris onto my shoulder, took Theo's hand, climbed 3 flights, opened the door to our home. A real one, now warm and sufficient, belonging to no one but us. I did not become this because of what Alaric Vaughan did. I became this in spite of it, through it and past it. Further past it than he will ever understand. The work of a restorer never truly ends. But this particular piece, the one I have been working on for the last 6 years, through every crack and every loss, and every careful, deliberate choice, I am satisfied with how it came out. And that in whatever language you tell, it is a masterpiece. If there's one thing I want you to take from this story, it's not the legal strategy. It's not the pigment compounds. It's something older. People have asked whether this is a story about family revenge. I once heard someone say that God doesn't restore things back to what they were. He restores them forward to what they were always meant to be. I believe that more than I believe in anything else. Family betrayal doesn't announce itself. It arrives slowly, dressed in the language of reason. And family revenge wasn't what I was after. What I built from the wreckage of family betrayal was not a counter-attack. It was a life. Don't be like me. Don't wait until you're standing at a hospital entrance at 3 in the morning to ask whether the life you're living actually belongs to you. You don't need a stolen painting or a federal investigation to give yourself permission to walk away from what is costing you more than it gives back. Leave earlier. Ask harder, trust the discomfort sooner. My personal belief: family betrayal marks you, but it does not define you unless you allow it to. And family revenge in its truest form is simply becoming the person they never believed you could be. If something in this story reached you, say it in the comments. Someone else may need to read exactly what you're about to write. If you believe it deserves a larger audience, share, hit subscribe, and let's keep this conversation going. Thank you for staying with me until the very end. The stories ahead contain some fictional elements, constructed for educational and reflective purposes. If that's not what you're here for, you're warmly invited to step away and find content that serves you better. No judgment ever. Alright, I'll leave it here for today. I appreciate you watching. I'll see you in the next one.